Indonesia is a success story. And now, of course, everybody's looking ahead to what the next president, former General Prabowo, who's been elected finally after several tries, what he's going to, how he's going to change things. And we've seen already that he's going to be much more active on foreign policy, which I think is good, because when I was ambassador, I was always trying to get the Indonesians to share more of their experience.
Hello, everyone. Indonesia, we were just literally saying this, is a country that is relatively unknown to most Americans, despite the fact that its importance on the world stage is increasing. It not only has one of the largest economies in the world, it's also one of the world's largest democracies, the largest Muslim majority country, and the largest producer of nickel, which we'll probably talk about, increasingly important material. But despite all of this, most Americans maybe know the movie The Year of Living Dangerously, and then somehow the Pope showed up in Indonesia a few weeks ago, and what does it all mean? We are very fortunate that we have with us tonight someone who can help mend this big gap in our knowledge. Helping us answer some of these questions is our guest tonight, Ambassador Robert Blake Jr., former ambassador to Indonesia and current senior managing director at McLarty Associates, where he leads Southeast Asia and climate practices. So good evening. I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of WorldBoston, and very happy to be here tonight with you at Great Decisions. Tonight's speaker, for the sake of time and his request, I'm abbreviating a very impressive biography. So Robert Blake Jr. served for 31 years in the State Department. From 2013 to 16, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, where he focused on building stronger business and educational ties. He also served as senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, in 2022. In 2009, he was nominated by President Obama to be Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, in which capacity he served until 2013. And he was, for that, awarded the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert Blake.
Now we've successfully used up all the time.
Thanks again for being here. Wow, there is a lot to learn about Indonesia. Wow, what a treat. It's a very fascinating place. And I want to kind of go on a trip with you, if you will, for our time to get us situated in the basics of kind of history and politics, because again, Year of Living Dangerously, and then a lot of people fade out. Maybe touch a little bit on economics and environmental concerns, and then we'll come back to politics and global matters. So maybe we could understand your take on the history of Indonesia, the main periods that we should be aware of. You know, you're on your flight into Jakarta as incoming ambassador and trying to make sense of recent history of the place.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
So, well, like every Foreign Service officer, you do a lot of reading before you arrive, and read whatever books there are. There weren't that many books on Indonesia, at least in English, so it wasn't that easy to find things, but you know, you manage. There's plenty. And you know, I think what I learned, just the key facts, obviously they became independent from the Dutch in 1949. They were famously one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement in the 1950s. They hosted the famous Bandung Conference, which was considered sort of the birth of the non-aligned movement, which is a city in central Java. And really, ever since then, they've had a very independent foreign policy and tried to very much to not be aligned either with the United States or China. They haven't had too many leaders. They had Sukarno was their first president, and then another general, Suharto, came into power in 1967. He was in power until 1998. And 1998, I think, was really probably the most important date for many of you to understand, because that was when Suharto was pushed out. There was a lot of concerns about his family's corruption, and he left power, and the Indonesians did a very, very important thing, which was to establish a real democracy. And that wasn't an easy thing at the time, because the military had a lot of power, and the military voluntarily gave up that power and supported this transition to a more democratic society. And ever since then, they've had a series of elections that have been, I think, by most standards, judged free and fair. There was a famous president called SBY. His last name was Yudhoyono. He was in power for 10 years, just before I arrived. So his last year in office I was there for. And he had been a general himself, but was a very strong supporter of democracy and wanted to make sure that the military stayed out of politics. And I think that really kind of, his role really cemented that. And we've seen a very good and strong division between, the civilian rule and the military ever since, which has been great. More recently, President Jokowi has been in power for the last 10 years. He was a little bit of an outsider. He was a guy that came in. He'd been a small town mayor in central Java, and he was elected. He then became mayor of Jakarta, the governor of Jakarta, and people really admired him because he'd been a furniture salesman and, again, a small town mayor. He wasn't from one of the elite families. He wasn't from the military. He was a real outsider. So there was a sense that here was a guy that could finally start to deal with corruption and kind of lead the new Indonesia. And debatable how much he did on the political side, but certainly on the economic side, I think he deserves a lot of credit for really diversifying the economy. When I first arrived, Indonesia really relied on commodity exports that were not in any way processed, and then on consumption, local consumption. And commodity exports, as you all know, the prices of those go up and down, so it was very hard for them to do any kind of planning. So he sensibly said, let's try to figure out how we can do better. And so they developed a very strong digital economy, which is now the largest in Southeast Asia and very, very active. And all of our big companies now are heavily invested in Indonesia, in the digital economy. And in the process of doing that, they set up these huge e-commerce companies like Amazon, but the Indonesian equivalent of those. And they played quite an important role in helping to integrate, the far reaches of Indonesia. If you look at it on a map, I think everybody saw that map that's interspersed. Indonesia is a huge, huge place. And traditionally Java, the central part of Java.
Size of the U.S.
Right. There you can see Java has been the kind of linchpin of the economy. And so his idea was to try to sort of broaden growth opportunities for everybody, and the e-commerce companies played a very important role. More recently, you've seen the growth of what he calls the green economy. And that's, Mary mentioned nickel. So they're now developing the entire supply chain of electric vehicles. So they have the nickel, but they've attracted investments into EV batteries, and now they're getting Hyundai and Chinese and other companies interested in actually manufacturing the vehicles in Indonesia. So all of that has been to the good. They've had a pretty impressive 5 to 6% growth rate for the last 15 years now, which has been good and helped lift a lot of Indonesians out of poverty. The poverty rate is below 10% now, which is good. But they've got huge challenges ahead. They want to be a high-income country by 2045, which is a very tall task. You all may have seen there was an interesting article by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times yesterday or the day before that 108 countries around the world aspire to be, that are middle-income countries now aspire to be high-income countries, and very few of them ever make it because they're not open enough. They're not open to ideas. They're not open to trade. And Indonesia risks a little bit of that. They're becoming more and more protectionist. and the big sort of conglomerates that dominate Indonesia have successfully resisted allowing competition into that would affect their bottom line. So that will have to change if they're really going to reach this 2045 goal of theirs. But nonetheless, I don't want to detract from it. I think on the whole, Indonesia is a success story. And now, of course, everybody's looking ahead to what the next president, former General Prabowo, who has been elected finally after several tries, what he's going to, how he's going to change things. And we've seen already that he's going to be much more active on foreign policy, which I think is good, because when I was ambassador, I was always trying to get the Indonesians to share more of their experience. For example, with the countries of the Middle East after the Arab Spring. Many of them were going through exactly what the Indonesians went through in 1998. And very few of them did what Indonesia did. And I said, you guys could really, we will help you, but it would be really great to have some of your former generals and former political leaders go and talk to these people in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean, and tell them about your experience, and tell them that democracy is a scary thing, but it'll work, and in the long run, it's going to help your country a lot. And they just didn't want to do it. They were like, no, nobody really cares about Indonesia. And they were kind of very reticent and shy about sharing their experience.
I wonder if we can dig into that
Yeah.
a little bit.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go on. That was sort of a little bit of an introduction.
It's a great introduction, but looking over this great sweep of Indonesian history, it's interesting that you make the comparison to the Arab Spring, because I'm wondering, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, how much of a stable democracy is this really? To an outsider, you can see the same names popping up a lot. President Sukarno, and then his daughter was president decades later. We have Jokowi's
son, now the vice president.
Yeah, the vice president for upcoming President Prabowo. So we say that Jokowi or Widodo is the first non-elite president, but is this really working? Are these people, the Indonesian leadership, truly representative, or is it just kind of a circle of the same 100 people who keep showing up?
Well, it's interesting.
And I relate that actually, to the Arab Spring, because there has to be some popular sense that we're being heard and we're being represented.
Well, obviously, democracy is not just about elections. And so one of the things that I was impressed about when I was in Indonesia was that, there's been a lot of power has been decentralized to the provinces, the 34 provinces, and then there's also districts below that. And so they have a lot of authority now, and they sort of run the country out in their hinterlands. Jakarta is very, very far away for most of them. Mm-hmm. But also they have, vibrant press, vibrant NGO community. And we worked very closely with all of them and really tried to encourage that. But to answer your direct question about the politics of it, you're right. And what's been interesting is that you've seen a little bit of a pushback by a lot of the younger generation who were sort of saying, wait a minute, why is this being allowed to happen? And we've seen that when, for example, the Constitutional Council ruled that Jokowi's son, who was quite young, they would basically waive the age requirements so that he could run for office. And there was a lot of protests about that, and a lot of people saying, "Wait a minute, this is doing what we've always said we don't want to do, and we don't. In fact, we want to abide by our Constitution." And more recently, there was an even more interesting case where the Constitutional Council went in the other direction and tried to reduce the threshold that's required. It's a 20% threshold for votes to actually get seats in Parliament. And the Constitutional Council said, that just makes it too hard. It just favors the big parties. Let's reduce that. And then the National Assembly tried to change it back to what it was, and there was this huge protest by young people, which I thought was a very good sign. And it just, again, people are very aware of their rights, and there's been before COVID, there were lots of demonstrations about corruption and things like that. So I think more and more young people are getting out in the streets. They're getting their voices heard. They're pushing their government to do things on things like climate change that they haven't really done before. So it's like democracy's doing pretty well, and particularly in the rest, if you compare it to the rest of Southeast Asia, places like Thailand and Vietnam that are still very much works in progress on democracy.
So another element of the Arab Spring, obviously, was, and I didn't mean to talk at length about the Arab Spring, but it's such an interesting comparison. Obviously, was fundamentalism in religion. Obviously, the biggest Muslim majority country in the world, relatively stable, or I should say, tolerant of different faiths. The Pope, dropped by a few weeks ago. First of all, is that actually true? And then secondly, how have they done that? Why have they not fallen prey to the influence of fundamentalism?
Well, I think a lot of it is that they did, I think, consciously decide to develop their democracy and provide more opportunities and provide opportunities for political engagement for Muslims of all kinds. So there's several Muslim political parties. Of course, they have their own newspapers. So there are plenty of opportunities for them to organize and get out their viewpoints. They also cracked down quite heavily. Many of you might remember the famous Bali bombings in the early 2000s that killed hundreds of people. That was by a quite radical, terrorist group. And a lot of them had been trained in Afghanistan and then came back and formed the nucleus of this group. Their numbers were then arrested. There was a huge crackdown that took place. But they still allowed the moderate Muslims to continue to have their parties and so forth. So there was a very strong crackdown with our support, by the way, with the United States. And I think that's been largely successful. Al-Qaeda has tried to organize in Indonesia. They've had an affiliate in the Philippines that has been pretty active, but they've never really been able to get much traction in Indonesia because it just, there just isn't that much appetite for it anymore. And again, people feel like they have plenty of opportunities to get what they want to get done through political means and through democratic means, so they don't need to. And there's not the same grievances that you have in other countries. So people largely have pretty good economic opportunities. Corruption is serious, but it's not so serious that it's inhibiting the rise of others. It's more at sort of the very, very top level of government. And there is a pretty strong corruption eradication commission that has, again, with our help, we gave them the power to tap telephones. And so they have, not surprisingly, a 100% conviction rate. And one of the knocks against Jokowi is that they became so successful that the conglomerates lobbied him to weaken the power of the Corruption Eradication Commission, which he did. So he put a layer of bureaucracy on top. They're still active, but not as active and not as independent as they once were. And that's a source of unhappiness for a lot of young people. All
right, we need to be sure to get plenty of questions, but there's really so much to talk about regarding Indonesia. I will jump over some things.
Sure.
I'm just picking up just bits and pieces.
Want to talk the C word, China?
Yes, the bits and pieces that people may have heard about, as I have. Why is I guess he's still president, and that's also a question why he was elected. The elections were in February, and they're not actually doing a handover until October, which is a pretty long transition. But why are they moving the capital? And is that sort of a grand folly? It doesn't seem to be moving very fast.
It is a bit of a grand folly. The sensible reason is that roughly a quarter of Jakarta is underwater because of climate change. Both rising sea levels, but also subsidence because they've been using up their groundwater too fast. And so at various times of the year, large parts of Jakarta are underwater, which is a serious problem. So, and there wasn't really that much room to grow. Jakarta is already a huge urban area. If you think about Greater Jakarta, it's one of the largest urban areas in all of the world. About almost 30 million people live in and around Jakarta. So there was a sense that they needed to move. And also, I think, like, as in many of these experiments in places like Kazakhstan and Myanmar and other, well, they wanted to choose a capital that was more centrally located and maybe diversify opportunities outside of Java. So I think that was a little bit of Jokowi's thinking. But as you say, there hasn't been a great deal of enthusiasm for this. And so far, the business community has not really invested heavily in it. Mostly it's been government money that's gone into building Nusantara, as they call it, in the eastern part of Kalimantan, which is the southern part of Borneo. So I'd say it's very much a work in progress. Jokowi is very committed to this, but not clear how committed Prabowo will be. I think he claims to still want to do this, but I don't think it's his top priority like it has been for Jokowi. So we'll see.
Okay, so I promised I would come back to geopolitics. One of the founders of ASEAN, also one of the founders of the non-aligned movement. It sounds like Indonesia is pretty happy with its position in the world,
Yep.
in a sense. What is challenging its non-aligned status, and should we be concerned about that? That's a very simple question for a huge
we shouldn't
topic,
be concerned.
I mean, the South China Sea is right next door, for example.
So I'm sure all of you have heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is this $1 trillion magnum plan to establish a network of infrastructure really from Beijing all around the world, but mostly through Asia and then really extending into Africa now. So Indonesia has been a big beneficiary of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there have been quite important projects. There's a famous high-speed rail project that goes from Jakarta to Bandung. That's a little bit controversial because it was a $6 billion project, and a lot of people thought the opportunity cost of that was pretty high. That could have been, they already had a rail line, so did they really need a high-speed rail? I'm not sure. There was a lot of debate about that. But in other things, the Chinese, for example, have helped Indonesia to develop a stainless steel capability from almost nothing. And now they're one of the larger exporters of stainless steel in the world. And then more famously now, all of the nickel processing that is taking place. Almost all of that is being done by the Chinese. And that is both good and bad. The Chinese are, from the Indonesian perspective, wonderful because they deliver very quickly, they deliver the financing, they have labor, they have basically a one-stop shop for a project, and they can get things done quite quickly. Whereas, if an American or European company were to come in, and most of our stuff is private sector-led, it's going to just take a lot longer. But there's also a real downside. The Chinese companies don't have any real respect for environmental rules, so there's been massive pollution and fish kills and pollution of rivers, and so lots of environmental problems, and then lots of labor problems as well. The Chinese don't treat their workers very well, and then the Indonesians that they hire are definitely not treated very well. So there's been lots of kind of nobody can demonstrate because they'd be fired, but it's been an issue. And so the Indonesians have been trying to diversify so that they're not entirely reliant on Chinese investment for a lot of these projects. But our American companies are not going to go in right now with a lot of these labor and environmental problems. And under our current system of the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not eligible for the tax relief. The processed nickel from Indonesia would not be eligible for tax relief here in the United States. in part because they're Chinese-owned, but in part because of all these labor and environmental problems. And so the Biden administration naturally very careful about wanting to, be strong with the labor movement, which is an important ally for them in the elections. So, so they've been sort of gingerly exploring what we call a critical minerals agreement that would allow us to, American companies to go in there. But even then, they're a little bit reluctant because they just sort of see that the Chinese have locked up a lot of this. And so
American businesses reluctant.
Yeah, as are EU companies. And so, but we have to be careful because we do not want to see the Chinese lock up all these critical minerals and then have us become dependent on them. So we do have an interest in trying to provide incentives to our companies to do this. So
and what would
I think that's going to happen, particularly if, well, really under either administration, if Trump or Vice President Harris is elected, because both of them recognize that we don't want to be dependent on the Chinese for these critical minerals.
And what would you say, how do you perceive Indonesian attitudes towards the U.S., towards China, and particularly now with a new president coming in?
The Indonesians, we're large investors in the country. I mentioned all the huge, Google and all of our digital economy companies. Mm-hmm. They're all there in a huge way. A lot in mining. The largest single investment in Indonesia is Freeport-McMoRan, which is a huge copper mine. And then increasingly now our exports and our investment has become highly diversified as the Indonesian economy itself has become diversified. But the Indonesians would like to see more, particularly in this critical mineral area, and again, because of the labor.
Well, beyond business, sort of in the popular view, is the U.S. perceived as a good global partner?
Yes, and I think people want to go to the United States. One of our most successful programs is something called the Youth Exchange Scholarship. And it's a scholarship for really only 80 kids for a year. They go and spend their junior year in high school, and they live with families out in little towns across America. And it's a hugely popular program. 8,000 people a year apply for these 80 slots. So it's amazingly competitive, and they come from all over Indonesia, and every single one of them has absolutely marvelous time, and they come back just glowing about the experiences that they had in the United States, and they're great ambassadors for us because they go back to their little communities around Indonesia, and so a lot of Indonesians do want to go to the United States. There is concern about gun violence. They do worry a little bit about that. During the Trump administration, there was a little bit of a concern about anti-Muslim, but I think what we did to try to combat that was we would get Indonesians who had studied the United States to come and speak at our public diplomacy platforms and have them reassure Indonesians that really gun violence is not going to affect them. The chances of it are very, very slim. And likewise, that there's anti-Muslim. There certainly is anti-Muslim sentiments, but not so much on campus. It's not going to affect them. So I think we were pretty successful in that. But it's still a long way for an Indonesian to travel to go study at USC or Harvard or wherever.
Right. Okay. 17,000 islands in 30 minutes. We just did it. So let's see if we have some questions.
Thanks. I'm Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Could you elaborate a little about the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement?
Sure.
ASEAN Digital Free Trade Agreement, really a great model for the world. And also, we just clocked past the 20-year anniversary of the independence of East Timor. Could you give us any quick update as to how Indonesia is feeling about that? Timor Gap, speaking of key resources. Thank you so much.
That's a lot.
I won't pretend to be an expert on East Timor, but so ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the free trade piece of this was started about 30 years ago now, And they've been making slow but steady progress since then to create an integrated market. I'll tell you one just interesting story. I ran into the Harley Davidson rep in Indonesia, and he said, "Oh, Bob, I got this great award." I said, "Oh, congratulations. How'd you do it?" He said, "Well, don't tell anybody. We just moved some of our assembly to Thailand, and then the tariffs from Thailand were much lower, of course. So anybody who wanted to buy a Harley Davidson anywhere in ASEAN, suddenly our market was much cheaper." And so the market for Harley Davidson motorcycles exploded. But that's this kind of small story about how ASEAN really does work, and there are lower tariffs, and so if you invest in any one of these countries, you can export at lower tariff rates to other ASEAN countries. And so it's increasingly become this huge market now. And for us, it's, believe it or not, one of the top 3 or 4 markets in the world now for our companies in terms of exports. And it's going to become more so over time because they're still a relatively young population in most of these countries. So it's going to sort of climb up the economic ladder in terms of economic importance for the United States. And Indonesia, of course, is the biggest of those countries, but Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, they're all doing quite well.
Do you want to say something about East Timor, or do you want to?
Well, East Timor, likewise has been kind of chugging along. They're also now about to join ASEAN, which I think will help them and help integrate them more. I mean, it's obviously a very small country, a very small economy, but I did not have the pleasure of visiting East Timor. I wish I had, but I did manage to get to 26 of the 34 provinces in Indonesia, so I felt like that needed to be my priority more than visiting the neighboring countries.
Okay, great. So we're going to go to Ed. Anybody else? I really encourage our students and first timers. If I can just see where you're going to be. No, all right, we'll go to Ed. Right here. Ed, raise your hand so we can get a mic. Oh, you have the mic. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a mic, yep.
All right.
Thank you, Ms. Ambassador. I have a question about China.
Sure.
China is already pushing against the Philippines, Vietnam, in the area there. Are they bumping up against Indonesia yet? And how do the government of Indonesia see China? That they're looking at that?
They are. Not to the same extent that they are in the Philippines and Vietnam, which is where sort of have been quite, But the Indonesians are concerned about what they see in the South China Sea and about China's growing military presence in the South China Sea and all of these islands. They are worried about what's going on now in the Philippines. And they themselves have experienced more and more Chinese incursions. So most of it has been in the form of Chinese gray hulls, Chinese Coast Guard, coming into Indonesian waters to interfere with Indonesian enforcement of against illegal Chinese fishing in Indonesian waters. Indonesia is 2/3 water. And so there's a lot of illegal fishing that goes on, and Chinese fishing boats are a large part of that. And so the Chinese have actually come in and intervened to prevent the Indonesian from arresting these which is of course drives the Indonesians crazy, and is a source of great concern. But more than that, they worry that as China begins to have the ability to project its power more and more, you'll see more and more of a presence in Indonesian waters, but also potentially even begin to try to control the Straits of Malacca and things like that, establish more zones of influence and control shipping, control even aviation routes.
Can we get the regional map up for a second? Yeah, okay, so there's Malaysia, South China Sea, et cetera.
So the way the Indonesians have responded is they have dramatically escalated their military cooperation with the United States. And so we have exercises, we're providing all kinds of military equipment to them, and none of it is cast as anti-China. The Indonesians don't characterize it like that, but they very much have been firm with the Chinese. And the Chinese assert what's called their 9-dash line, and part of that actually intersects with Indonesian waters, which have a lot of oil and gas in it. And the Indonesians have the Chinese have tried to say that's disputed territory. The Indonesians say, no, it's not, it's ours. And so they've been good about pushing back on that. And I think one of the lessons that many of us have learned is it's good to establish some red lines with the Chinese. And so far, the Chinese haven't really pushed back on that. And so the Indonesians are busily developing their military command up in that part where there is disputed territory. They are proceeding with oil and gas development. And again, they know that Indonesia is an important country for China as well. And so there's only limits to what China is going to do as well. And they don't want to jeopardize a lot of their economic access, for example. So it works both ways.
Great. So we had a question on Zoom. I'm going to interpret a bit how Gaza affects Indonesia's attitudes towards the United States. I'm wondering if maybe we could connect that to larger questions about perceived imperialism or former colonial territories, as Indonesia was. Go for it.
Yeah, support for Palestine has always been a sort of central tenet of Indonesian foreign policy. They've always had a strong concern about what's going on in the occupied territories. And so naturally, they're very concerned about what's been happening in Gaza, but also to a lesser extent what's been happening in the West Bank. And so this is, their concern has been reflected in much greater activism in the UN Security Council and in other, the Organization of the Islamic Conference and wherever else they can make public statements criticizing mostly Israel, but occasionally the United States too. They feel that the United States has not done enough to constrain Israel, much like many of our own people feel that we haven't done enough. But then they've also taken the next step, which is there's an Indonesian hospital in Gaza. They're regularly sending relief supplies through Jordan. So they're very, very active, and it's a huge issue. And there's no Israeli embassy in Jakarta, and so whenever there's a demonstration, it's in front of the American embassy. And again, there's anger both at Israel mostly, but also at the United States, because they feel like we have leverage over Israel that we're not using enough to bring this war to a close.
Okay, thank you. So up there, go right ahead.
Hi, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, so Indonesia has a lot of funding right now coming in around climate, like the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But there's also lots of change, like right now with the nickel and the capital city and the president. So from your international climate experience, what do you think are some climate policies that would make or break Indonesia in meeting their climate goals, which is, peak greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 and then hopefully better future? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So there's a lot to talk about on that. When I was ambassador, I was very involved. We set up a huge sustainable palm oil initiative to try to dramatically slow down deforestation that was taking place from these big palm oil companies, which was actually quite successful. The rates of deforestation have come down substantially in Indonesia, which has been good. And so they have a net zero 2030 target for their forest and land use, which is good. That's impressive. There's a little bit of concern that a greater attention and a greater emphasis on biofuels is going to perhaps rekindle more deforestation. So that's something that everybody's going to be watching pretty closely. But the key target now is really more on the energy use side. And as you say, there's John Kerry and his Japanese counterpart led a huge effort to negotiate a $20 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership, $10 billion from mostly G7 countries, $10 billion from international banks, to accelerate decarbonization in Indonesia and hopefully get them to move up a lot of their targets. So far, they have a net zero 2060 target, which is not consistent with the net zero 2050 target that everybody believes is necessary to achieve the 1.5 degree centigrade goal. So the problem is that Indonesia now has an excess coal capacity through 2028. So they've got to sort of get through that. But in the meantime, they are moving ahead with quite a lot of quite interesting projects outside of the main Java-Bali grid. So there's opportunities out in all of the islands in the east, for example, that mostly run now on imported diesel. So there's a huge opportunity to do more to replace that with solar and wind and battery storage. There's a very interesting project that's come up in Sumatra, north of Java, which is going to set up for the first time a cross-strait project with Singapore. And Singapore is building all these data centers, and like everybody, focusing on AI, but the Singaporeans said, you can't build any more data centers unless all of the energy is renewable. Of course, Singapore has no land. So they negotiated this deal with Indonesia that the Indonesians would set up a huge solar plant in Sumatra, build a subsea cable to a transmission line to export all of this power from solar. What the Indonesians got out of this is, for the first time, an indigenous capability to develop their own, to build their own solar panels in Indonesia, and to build their own battery storage. So hopefully that's going to drive down costs and help to really accelerate the deployment of renewables. But it's a work in progress. But I think, you know, we and the other G7 countries put a strategic bet on Indonesia because A, it's strategically important, but B, it was a country that wanted to improve its nationally determined contribution. So, you know, as I say, it's a work in progress, but I think this is a good thing, and you know, if we had a chance to do it again, we would.
Okay, we are winding down, so what we'll do is we'll take 2 questions at the same time.
Sure.
Hi, Ambassador Blake. My name is Listia. I am in Indonesian. And then I just graduated from Northeastern here in Boston with Fulbright scholarship, and I believe you managed that program when you were in Indonesia.
Yes.
So I want to go back to the nickel discussion.
Please.
From your expertise and experience in Indonesia, how do you think Indonesia can balance economic development with environmental sustainability, particularly in the areas like nickel mining for EV and also for like deforestation?
Okay, and then we're going to hop right over here to get 2 questions at once. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. In Africa, China has, its level of investment has saddled a number of countries with very large burdens of debt.
Yes.
Okay.
And also to some extent in Latin America. So I would ask, is that problem also present in their investment practices in Indonesia?
Great. Okay.
The answer to that one is not as much, because the Indonesians are very mindful of what happened in Sri Lanka and, as you say, in Africa and elsewhere. And so they were very careful to have a higher level of grant, but also lower interest rates, and therefore, so that it isn't as much of an issue, and they are able to service the debt. The problem in many of these BRI countries, in Sri Lanka, where I was ambassador, was that they were vanity projects for the presidents and things like that. And they never had a sufficient economic rate of return to be able to service the debt. And so that's why these countries got into terrible trouble. Mm-hmm. And, so one of the lessons learned is to make sure you actually pick projects that are going to have a real rate of return that are going to be really beneficial to the country. On your question of nickel, I think there really is a win-win here. The United States and several other countries have set up something called the Minerals Security Partnership. And it's basically a huge operation to provide financing for projects around the world. But the single most important condition is that they abide by international environmental and labor standards. And they have to, any company that signs up to try to get financing has to abide by a set of ESG principles that are clearly laid out. And I think that, so Indonesia has indicated an interest in joining the Minerals Security Partnership, which is great. And and therefore would have to, any project would have to abide by these ESG principles that I talked about. And as I say, as I'm sure you know, these are huge domestic issues in Indonesia, these labor and environmental problems in these Chinese projects. So this would be a win for Indonesian politicians if they were able to improve these standards and raise the level of concern about these things. And you know, they've always been worried that, oh, we can't tell the Chinese what to do because they'll pull out. I think that's wrong. The Chinese are there for their own interests. They're not there as a favor to the Indonesians. And so I think the Indonesians should have been tougher to begin with in terms of enforcing higher labor and environmental standards. But be that as it may, there is now an opportunity to join this mineral security partnership and to raise these standards. And then that will enable them to attract more investment from the United States and European countries and others who I think so far have been a little bit careful.
Okay, wonderful. So first, please join me in thanking Ambassador Robert Blake.
That seems so short.